Today's fly is the Steelhead Bee by Roderick Haig-Brown. The Steelhead Bee was originally tied to be a steelhead fly used in the Pacific Northwest. And as you can see on this particular steelhead fly, the wing is tied canted forward, unlike a Catskill dry fly. And this was to allow the fly to ride very low in the water's meniscus and create a V or a wake as it was being taken across the current. There's a few different ways that I like to tie this for warm water fishing. My favorite way of tying it, if I'm going to use the wing, is like this. What I'm doing here differently is, instead of using the red fox squirrel tail wing and tail, in this one I'm using dark moose body hair, which is a little bit more buoyant and I think adds a little bit to the flotation if we're going to be working this on calm pond water or some of the slower rivers in this area rather than waking it across the tail out of a fast rocky mountain stream. But an even better way I find to tie this fly and fish it is to tie it without the wing at all, and that is to tie it with the tail, which is the moose body fur, and the classic bee body, and then to use a brown hackle in what's called a variant style. And I find that the fish like that just fine, and it makes for a very easy fly to tie. So let's tie one that way. On this particular fly, I'm going to use an up-eye dry fly hook. That is a Mustad 94-842, which is the same as the Mustad 94-840. It's just that it has an up-eye rather than a down-eye, which I think is adds a little bit more elegance. I also use these for my soft hackle flies, but you can use any kind of a dry fly hook you want. I'm using a brown 8/0 thread. What we're going to do is we're going to start the thread right behind the eye. We're going to go ahead and bring that thread to about the halfway point of the shank, which is where we're going to tie in that tail. That's going to be roughly where the body is going to end. Now, what I've done is I've taken some of this dark moose body hair, which is that stuff right there, and I've cut off a little bit of it, and I've stacked it in a hair stacker. So I'm going to take this little bit of moose body hair that I've stacked, and I'm going to measure this so that the moose body hair is about the length of the hook shank. That's where I want it to be when it's tied off, so I'll move that into position, take a couple of wraps over the top of it, and then go ahead and follow that all the way back to the bend of the hook. Now, this is very much like deer hair in that it's going to flare somewhat when you get it under pressure, although not quite as much as deer body hair will. But still, it's got a lot of air in this fur, so it's going to flare a little bit, and that's going to add to the flotation of the fly as well. Now, because we're tying this in a variant style, we don't need to worry about a body at all. So what we're going to use is a dry fly dubbing. Here I'm using a Spirit River. This is a dry fly or Antron dubbing. The original fly, Roderick Haig-Brown Steelhead Bee, used seal fur for the body, which is both very, very difficult, and there's some legal questions about having it for fly tying, and it's extremely difficult to use as well. But this works wonderfully. It's readily available. We start with a little bit of the dark brown. What I want to do is I'm going to tie just a very small bump for the back end of that bee. Come up to the center section. Now I'm going to use about the same amount of yellow fur, and I'm not using a lot, I'm just using a very little tiny bit right there. I'm going to spin that onto the thread. You want to spin this on relatively tight, and I'm not using any wax. Go ahead and, with that center section, get that nice center stripe. That gives it that characteristic bumblebee sort of a look. And back to the brown. Roderick Haig-Brown, when he used this to fish the Campbell River and the Nisbet River in British Columbia back in the 1940s and 1950s, also used this a lot for West Slope cutthroat, for native cutthroat and even sea run cutthroat, and claims to at one point in time have caught a steelhead of over 20 pounds on this fly. For steelhead, he tied this up to a size 6, with most of his books talking about size 8s and size 10s. We're tying this, of course, in a size 12. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a very long and very high quality dry fly hackle in a standard fiery kind of a brown. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the entire hackle on this, because I like this pattern to be very heavily hackled. because we are fishing this primarily in this area for panfish. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to bring you this fly in June, is right now as we sit here tying this, the bluegill are just starting to get on their beds. The water temperature locally has just gotten into the lower 70s, so the bluegill are starting to spawn, and this is just a great pattern. And if you're tired of using things made out of cork and foam, you want something that's a little bit more natural, something a little bit more challenging to tie, yet is still robust enough to handle many fish. This is a great fly for that. And what I really like about it is after you've caught a few dozen bluegills on it, you can just take this and hold it over a steaming kettle of water, and that steam will go ahead and reset these hackles for you, so you can really get quite a bit of use out of it. But as you can see, even on this one, taking my time, it's pretty easy to tie up a dozen of these in about an hour while you're sitting around watching the television or having a cold brew on a hot night, waiting for the thunderstorm to hit, as we so often are these days. Tie off that hackle with just a couple of turns and get in there and clip out that hackle stem. All I can do is just bring that back so there's any stray pieces are folded back, and tie a neat little head. And what I'll do is I'll throw a whip finish onto that. Clip that thread. Now, one thing that I do, a lot of my flies, I don't really spend a lot of time gluing the heads. I'll do it on streamer flies where I want a nice glossy head. But very rarely do I use head cement on a fly. It's just not necessary, mostly because, well, if you've ever fished with me, you realize I lose most of my flies to trees long before I lose them to fish, so I don't worry about them holding together forever and ever. But in this case, this fly will absolutely take 50 or 60 fish before it comes off the end of my line. I want to make sure that's going to hold together pretty well. A little bit of glue, and there you have it, the Roderick Haig-Brown Steelhead Bee. You can fish that either with a wing or without a wing, as we have it there, or you can tie that on an up eye or a down eye hook. And that's just a really neat little fly to fish for panfish, great for smallmouth bass, for rock bass, any kind of small warm water fish. It's just a neat pattern to have, and it looks very pretty sitting up on the water. Enjoy.